Hello and welcome to Straight On Till Disney, a Disney deep dive and analysis podcast, where each week I, your host Jonathan, deep dives into the history of each Disney film and the legacy that they left behind. I'd like to remind you that you can follow me on Instagram at Straight On Till Disney Pod. Onto the podcast. So this week I'm going to be taking a deep dive into the first Disney feature film, Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs. And what I found really interesting is this unique and integral role that this film really played in telling the story of Disney and what it really meant. So, what I found really interesting is that in 1934, Walt Disney got up on a stage and sat there and pitched the entirety of the film that he wanted to tell. From beginning to end, he pitched this entire narrative of Snow White, Prince, the dwarfs, the evil queen, this entire narrative on stage, and then left at the end that this was going to be a Disney feature film. And that very much scared and very much terrified animators because of how much of a risk this would be, especially in the 1930s. And that really was what was at the core of this film, was how much of a risk it was. Because even Disney himself had put his house on the line for this film to succeed. The belief Disney showed at this presentation proved to be infectious, though. Although a lot of animators, as likely, were taken aback by the thought of doing such a big film and a feature film at the length of 80 minutes and bringing that then to life. So that very much terrified them, and rightly so, to be honest, because they'd never done something on a scale like this before. One of the animators and art director, Ken Anderson, says this really interesting quote. He was doing something other studios hadn't ever attempted, and that very much set the bar for what Disney wanted to achieve and create this very much avant-garde style film that wasn't like anything out there, and that very much would put his stamp on the filmmaking industry as a whole. And I do find that incredibly interesting and unique to think about, that Disney very much, he wanted to create this dynamic and unique piece that very much set the tone for other feature films that he would eventually end up going on to create. However, finances would prove to be tricky, and honestly a recurring problem throughout many of Disney's history, to be honest. The budget for Snow White was somewhere between $250 million and $500 million alone, and that very much was 10 times the cost of a Disney short. And that very much showcases how much of a risk this film was, how much they were putting on the line to create this film. And that very much really showcases this unique thing. But one of the things I find really interesting about looking at the production history is that Disney, his animators, then brought in live actors to perform some of the characters' movements. And I find that incredibly interesting and unique to think about, because it allowed them to be able to work out how they were going to do something. So they were able to work out how a hand might move, how somebody might walk, dancing, right down to the way that a clothing would move. And that very much showcases the care and detail that they had in crafting this beautiful film. And I really find there's so many elements of this film that I find really charming and enchanting to watch. From someone who doesn't necessarily gravitate to watching Snow White, I did find myself quite enjoying in the film. And that's down to the way that this film is crafted and created. And one of these scenes in particular was traced by layout artist Ken O'Connor. And although the proportions were then later changed, it very much highlights and showcases the intention, the execution for what they wanted to achieve from this film. And what I find interesting that every stage of this film was technically challenging. And that's rightfully so, down from storytelling for what they wanted to achieve, how they wanted a character design. It very much stemmed from that. And I do find it quite interesting the way that this was then later done. And it's very much in turn of crafting this really beautiful scene. And I think ultimately it creates this unique perspective of creating unique and dynamic storytelling that allows for a beautiful and crafted film. And one of the things I find beautiful from this film is the way it uses soundscape, the way it uses its art style animated. And I do think, as much as I adore the later, some of the revival era films, I do think at times we are missing that animated style, that dynamic and beautiful storytelling that looks like a picture book come to life on screen. And as beautiful as the computer generated imagery is these days, there is this kind of nostalgic look, even if it wasn't nostalgic to me, there is this nostalgic element to crafting these Disney films and watching them from how much care and detail went into them. One of the other things I found beautiful was its score. And through my research, I found out who created the score for this film, and that was Paul J. Smith, Albert Hay Malott, and Milt Franklin. And what they do with this beautiful score is they develop it to craft tension where tension's needed. You know what type of scene you're watching from the way that the score moves, the way that the score essentially tells the narrative of what we should be feeling in a scene. And it really allows audiences to be able to watch and they're not being told what's happening as much as they would used to do. And it really allows for a much more organic and unique nuance approach to storytelling, in the fact that you understand what is happening on screen because you've heard this motif in the background that really denotes the style, what you're thinking. You instantly know it's a Snow White scene from the whimsical, magical feel of a scene. You instantly know it's the Evil Queen when you hear this more darker melody that really fits the tone of what the Evil Queen is wanting to achieve in a scene. And another thing that I found beautiful with this film that I really find interesting to craft myself is the Foley sound. And I went back and found who the Foley artist for Snow White was, and that was John James MacDonald. And what I beautifully love with this film is the way that Foley sound is used to craft things. And I really noticed it more with them walking up the stairs, and how each of these scenes where the animals are running up the stairs, you can really feel the creaks of the wood. You feel each of the different animals' feet really creak and crack atop these beautiful scenery. And you also get it with the dwarfs when they're creaking up the stairs to go and face the creature that they think is in their house, sitting in their chair, sleeping in their bed. And I do think it's really interesting that the way it was used, maybe through coconuts going plink, clonk, plink, or maybe even just cranking on leaves, crunching them, or even planks of wood, and allowing that to be mixed together really creates this unique soundscape for a really beautiful and dynamic film that really allows for something new to be seen on screen. As behold, Snow White required the work of 750 artists, 32 animators, 25 background artists, and 102 assistants, and the creation of thousands of drawings. And that very much just showcases the depth, the care, the love that was poured into this film. And what I really love is that the opening of this film credits all these beautiful people and showcases that this was very much a team effort in crafting a unique and dynamic narrative on screen. And I really appreciate that. And very much it showcases how animation takes so long, because there were ups and downs in the 3 years it took to craft this film. And one of the things I really find interesting is when fans really want to see a film, the second film, the next film. But I do think people forget that animation takes so long to create. It's no secret that it took 6 years for a Frozen sequel. It's taken 10 years for Zootopia 2. And it took 9 years for Moana 2. But that's its own separate production history issue when we get there. And I do think we need to remember that animation takes a long time to craft. But as I've said, this film was a risk, and many people weren't willing to take a chance on it. However, Hollywood producer Walter Wanger told them, millions of people are going to like it. If Disney does as well as I know he'll do, they'll go for it. That very much shows there was some people backing this film and backing Disney's work, because they'd seen the shorts that had come before. They'd seen what was capable and what audiences would maybe gravitate towards, and seeing other characters being told on screen. And very much Disney had been successful with the cartoons of Mickey and Minnie and Goofy, for example. And now audience wanted to see what else Disney could do, what other stories could be told. And I think that's what made Snow White as much as a success as any other Disney film would go on to do. And that really allows for a unique thing. Another person who backed the film was W.G. Van Schumus, the owner of Radio City Music Hall in New York. And he went to Disney's studio while it was still being finished, and on strength of it, booked the film for the theatre. And at the time he said, "I'll book Snow White for the music hall, sight unseen." Scummers would talk about, "When can I have it?" And that really showcases how beautiful the sound score must have been, and the beauty of this beautiful film for somebody of his quality and crowd to go, "I want this. When is it done?" And I do think it's a really unique and interesting thing to think about in terms of talking about. And I really think it was a unique and thing to think about. And therefore, the pressure of getting the film made meant that Snow White's now familiar songs were actually recorded quite quickly. And Ariana Castellotti, the voice of Snow White, herself talked about this process. And she said in an interview with Cinemagic at the time, all the dialogue and musical portions were done in a rather short period of time. Then was a little dubbing to do after the animation was finished. But I always felt very much a part of the Disney family, even though I probably didn't work at the studio more than a week or two. And that very much showcased that even though she was only there for so much, she really cared about the performance. She really wanted this to do so well. And that very much allowed for a unique thing to think about. And I do think that very much it is down to all these people who worked on the film that they wanted it to be such a success. They wanted this film to be beautifully done. And I really think that that is a unique and very unique perspective to have on. And one of the things I found out, and that I definitely didn't know, and I don't know if many people do, and I found this on the Disney Wiki about Prince, who is very much not very present in this film, which is where some of the controversy over the kissing when she's under the sleeping kiss, which I'll touch upon when we get into the film, comes from. So the prince, the wiki says, was the first realistic human male that the Disney animators attempted to bring to life. However, it was found that the prince was then the hardest of all characters to animate, and for this reason, his role in the film is minor, which is why he only makes 2 appearances in the film, which I find quite interesting that he was so difficult to animate. And I wonder what parts of it was so hard to animate. The prince's physical form appearance was inspired by Douglas Fairbanks Jr., and the prince was partially animated by Miltkar, who would then later be given the similarly difficult tasks of the animation of the Prince Charming and Prince Philip in Cinderella and Sleeping Beauty, respectively. And originally planned, this was the original plan for the prince's role of the film. That jealous of the prince's affections for Snow White, the queen would have him brought to her, and she would have him locked in her dungeons. As the witch, she would have made the skeletons in the dungeon get up and dance. She would then leave the prince in the dungeon, and he was to escape the manor of Errol Flynn, enabling him to reach Snow White and break the spell. After escaping, the forest animals were to tell him where to go. However, only the horse was to understand, causing the prince to take the long route and arrive too late to save Snow White. The idea would later be abandoned when it was realised how difficult it would be to animate the prince convincingly, and thus the character only appeared when he needed to further the story, which centred primarily around the relationship between Snow White and the Queen. And I think that's far interesting and unique to think about, that this character was meant to do so much more, but because of how difficult it was to animate a character in that time period, that is why he doesn't appear as much as he did as they wanted to. And that very much showcases a real understanding that not everything was able to be crafted in the 1930s. So let's talk about the film. I find it quite enchanting and something unique thing, because the source material for the film is based on the 1812 Brothers Grimm tale of Snow White, where Snow White is born to mother and father. The mother dies, and then the king marries the evil stepmother, which I find quite interesting, that a lot of fairy tales tend to villainize step parents over the nuclear family. And I do understand that that's a very much of a societal thing, that at the time society deemed a family a man, a woman, and then the child. And obviously that's very much changed now within society, but it's an interesting thing to think about and look at, especially with Cinderella also having that step parent relationship of being villainized. I do think it's quite an interesting and unique thing to look at. So the film opens up with the evil queen talking to the mirror, going, "Mirror, mirror on the wall, who's the fairest of them all?" And Snow White is deemed the fairest in the land. And she's so angry. She hates the fact that she is not prettier than Snow White, a teenager. Because Snow White in this film is 14. Which is, I think, another reason why the controversy of the kiss later on in the film is very much, it's not great, but context is very much needed. And I'll discuss it when I get to it in a bit. So we then get Snow White wishing while she's cleaning in the garden, and then the prince arrives. And one thing I never realised is that she runs off from the prince. She doesn't stand there and join him in song as he starts to join in with her. She rushes off because she's frightened of this stranger. And that's something I never ever thought about, because you deem it of, oh, it was love at first sight. And actually, it's not too much later in the film that she admits that she actually does quite like this prince. And very much, to be fair, she doesn't know he's a prince. And I don't think he knows she's a princess. And I think that's another interesting element to think about, is that they don't really care about the fact that they're royalty. They just develop this connection through song. Because to be fair, as I've just discussed, the prince is barely in the film. He's barely a character himself, to the point where his name, Prince Florian, came long after the film was released. So you're like, you don't really know if that's the true name for him. But I do find it quite interesting that's the direction we went down. So Snow White is then busy cleaning in the kitchen and doing all the stuff that they would do. And so the evil queen hires a huntsman to kill Snow White for the fact that she's prettier than her. Hmm. I think that's my only real criticism of this film. That there's no real backstory, there's no real inference to why the evil queen hates Snow White so much, other than the fact that she's prettier than her. And I know it's very much a concept and contrast to society of the time. The women were deemed to look prim and proper and feel beauty for male attention, and to look pretty for the man while the man goes out. It's a very interesting and unique thing to think about, to be honest. And ultimately, I don't know if I quite like that aspect of it, but I understand that that's the concept at the time. It's the context of what society was like back then. And I do find that quite interesting and unique to think about in terms of looking out into unique and interesting views. And I really think that we need to think about that and deep dive into the context of the film. And I really find that quite fascinating and interesting to look at in terms of talking about this film and remembering that there's a lot of context behind the film, and that it was it's a product of its time, and it really much is that. So Snow White goes out into the forest with the huntsman. Huntsman tries to kill her, doesn't kill her, tells her to run off into the forest and never return. She does so in this beautifully cinematic, and it's beautifully done with the score, the lighting, the direction, and all come together to create this beautiful montage sequence of her running through the forest, terrified for her life. And that is something that I think we forget about this film, is that this is a teenager who's now fighting for survival. She's left on her own. She has no parents. She has no one to turn to. And it's very much this fight for survival in terms of this teenage character that I don't think we think about when it comes to finding the dwarf's cottage with the animals and this kindness here. She's kind to all these people, so they help her. Oh, and when they go to the cottage and do the Whistle While You Work song, as much as it's this society construct that Snow White as the woman would do the cooking, the cleaning, what she's really doing here is she's seeing this place, knowing the people who live there. Right, let me cook, let me clean, let me do everything. So that when they come back, they can be grateful and might want to help me. They might want to look after me. And this instinct of survival of what can I do that looks to seem helpful and aid in these people when I can do something about it. And that's really interesting to think about when the dwarfs come back from the working in the mines, and you get this contrast of I've just cooked and cleaned while these men have been working in the mines doing the work and then coming home to the woman who they don't know about yet. But it is an interesting concept of that contrast in actually, as much as it is society's beliefs of the men and the women and the job roles, there's actually this really interesting, unique battle for survival that's in her that we don't really give Snow White credit for. And I don't think it was intentional on Disney's part to create this unique perspective that I don't think I've seen many people talk about before. And I do think, interestingly, it is this real pull to survive. The evil queen wants me dead. She wants me gone. Right, where can I go? There's nowhere to go. Oh, there's this cottage. Right, let me see. Let me see who lives here. Oh, there's people who live here. Right, let me cook, let me clean, let me make it look nice. And it really is this really unique perspective to have on this film, in that we understand the level of Snow White and that she's this kindness to others, even though they don't really know her. She's this kind and generous soul that really wants to help everyone. So the dwarfs meet her. You get, and this is the bit of the film that I think, if I was gonna cut anything, it would be this, and maybe this was added in because they couldn't have the Prince sequence and stuff. But the you go and wash your hands bit, I did kind of dip out of it because it was a bit like, it doesn't really feel like we're adding anything to the narrative here. And I know it's really more to showcase the relationship between Snow White and the dwarfs, but I don't think it's really necessary. Maybe that's just my opinion, that it feels like a bit of a lull in the story till the evil queen finds out that Snow White's not dead and goes down and becomes the hag, creates the poison apple, dips it in the sleeping curse, and you get the witch element of her creating spells, potions. You see what this woman is capable of, and I think that's really interesting. Is you get to see and showcase and highlight this turmoil of I will do anything to get what I want. I will do anything to be the prettiest, the best, the fairest in the land. And I do think that's a really interesting ideology and construct and social commentary of the time that this film was crafted and created in the 1930s, especially after the success of the Roaring Twenties and this fabulousness. I do think it's very much internal and interesting construct of what society then deems men and women to be like and what they should be seeking. And that's really, really interesting to think about. So the evil queen, as the hag, gives Snow White the apple. And one of the things I find really interesting and unique for Snow White is that it's not, she has to be the one to eat it. She can't just take it. She has to take it willingly. And that gives this Snow White some agency. And I don't really think it works as much as it does in some later stuff that really adapt it. Just because there's no real backstory for why it happens, for why. I think as much as the beautiful, whimsical fairy tale narrative of it, I do think there's just something missing that the live action tries to execute, but executes it horrendously. And once I will talk about the live action at some point, but I think the live action had so many beautiful ideas, so many interesting constructs that I think I was more fascinated because I don't have an attachment with Snow White, and seeing how well the live action Cinderella was done, I was really excited for this, and I was just bored by the live action Snow White in the end. It just didn't seem to add anything. And there's things that they did add that I'm like, why? And I think as audiences, you probably know the things that I'm talking about, of the things that I go, why? Because I just don't think they were necessary or added anything to the story of Snow White. And really, I think in terms of narrative and story, it's just a bit like, really? So Snow White falls into the sleeping curse. The dwarfs, in another beautifully animated sequence that includes thunder, lightning, rain. It showcases off what the directors, the sound and camera and the cinematography can create with animated drawings. And I find it one of the best sequences of the film. So when they chase the evil queen up into the tree and then she does fall to her death. And it is a beautiful sequence that really gives her the comeuppance, I think, that she really deserves in terms of narrative, that her quest for beauty is what's driven her to her death. And that in the end, she was just as ugly on the outside as she was on the inside. And I do think that's a really interesting connotation and construct on society. And we then get the prince finding out that Snow White is in a coffin, in a glass coffin, that the dwarfs have made because the dwarfs deem her too beautiful to bury her. And then he wakes her up with true love's kiss. And I know this bit is very controversial to many audiences because of what it connotates, that a man will come and rescue you. But to me, it's already been built throughout this film that there's already this connection between Snow White and the prince. There's already this understanding, and that there's something there that they both want to discover. And yes, I understand why audiences are critical, why they deem it not great. But what I think we need to remember is you can tell audiences that this is a beautiful, beautiful film. And I think the idea of Snow White and the Sleeping Curse and her being asleep is such a vital and important part of the story that you can't really take it out And as much as you try and want to reinvent it, as other things have done, other interpretations and adaptations of Snow White, which I'll talk about soon, have done themselves and made it a bit more interesting and dynamic, this is a really beautiful film. And I think audiences need to remember when they're showing this to younger viewers, is you can tell them this is a beautiful, beautiful film, but there's things in here that aren't what we agree with now in society. And it's just about teaching them why we don't agree with it. What is the connotation behind that? How has society in turn changed and allowed this to craft a beautiful and unique storytelling device that allows from danger to showcase what we don't do. We don't take apples off strangers. And I think that's the thing that we need to remember, that there is so much context behind this film, that it was crafted in the 1930s. We're almost looking, it's almost 100 years old, the original Snow White. And that's something that I think we need to remember, is that this is almost a century ago, which is scary to think about. This film is 80 plus years old, and the ideologies and concepts and contextual societal notions on this film we don't agree with anymore. And I think it's just a case of us teaching audiences and younger viewers who don't know this film, who weren't clearly don't know the story, and allowing them to see it in a new light, which is what I really hope the live action would do. But it really doesn't. And it really annoys me because it has some beautiful songs and it really develops it. And I think the way that they interlope the idea of the kiss in being in one of the songs, there's the lyrics of, if there's a world where you wake me, promise me you'll wake me. And it just adds a little bit more context to waking her up at the end of the film, but I just don't feel it's done in the best way. I think Once Upon a Time does it best that I've seen, in it being, yes, you get the kiss at the beginning. The show opens with Prince Charming waking Snow White up from sleeping curse in the coffin, but it builds on it. There's this entire backstory that over the course of the first season, you understand and develop, and you understand why the Evil Queen's doing this, what really was it. And I think that's my only real big criticism of the animated Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, is there's so much potential for really deep backstory that maybe necessarily is not needed, but I just think it would have added and allowed the relationship between Snow White and the Queen to be something a bit more dynamic, a bit more interesting, because they are really foils to each other. And what I really like is that the costuming also is a foil to each other, because Snow White is dressed in blue, red, and yellow, and the Evil Queen is dressed in this royal purple. And if you think about it, red and blue mixed together, it creates purple. And on a colour wheel, yellow is opposite purple. So you've got this real foil in terms of creating a story and crafting this beautiful lyrical cement of this juxtaposition between the way that they dressed as well, that I find quite interesting and new to think about. So what is the legacy that Snow White has left behind? Well, Snow White appeared in many video games, appeared in the parks, which we'll get onto. There's been many adaptations of Snow White in live action. There's been the Snow White and the Huntsman films, Once Upon a Time that I've just talked about, the live action Snow White film, Mirror Mirror. She's appeared as many of the Snow White characters in the House of the Mouse. She's also made an appearance in Kingdom of Hearts, the video game. She's a playable character in Disney Magic Kingdoms. There were assets for Snow White in Disney Infinity, with Snow White, Grumpy, Dopey, all having buildable the townspeople figures. There were power discs for her. There's been many Lego sets recently. Just recently, we've had the Seven Dwarfs adult Lego set, which showcases that Snow White in media and really has allowed this thing. And she was the original Disney princess. So obviously the Disney princess line wouldn't exist really without her beginning this all. And interestingly, same with the Evil Queen, kicking off the Disney villain line. There's not really a prince line, but I would love that. Just saying, Disney. That would be nice. Let the princes be in the parks more, please. Because I do think it's a bit. Like you don't really get to see the princes as much in the Disney parks. Unless they're in the parade. That's it, really. And I do find it a bit sad at times. That you don't really get to see these characters. I think Snow White's more ingrained, and as is the Evil Queen. Because she is an icon online, especially Disney California Adventure. I think half of the shorts, things, reels that I see from Disneyland California Adventure or the Disneyland Park in California is the Evil Queen. And she's brilliant at her job. So I do think it's a bit like, I'd really like to see more of those characters enter the parks, really. And it would be nice maybe once in a while that you do get to meet Florian a bit more when he was around. And yeah, and I think some of the dwarfs would be nice. You can see Grumpy and Dopey would be. I think they're the more iconic dwarfs that I think maybe around Snow White, around Seven Dwarfs Mine Train, you could have that kind of interaction. But yeah, so Snow White in terms of attractions has really been started in 1955 with what I know it as Snow White's Scary Adventure, which is a dark ride. And what that ride, the ride is very much taking you through the story of Snow White and the film, and very much in a sense to a lot of other dark rides that were brought in. You are Snow White. Snow White's not in the ride. You are in the perspective of Snow White going through it all, and it's a really interesting and unique thing to do. And you being in that, you become that character in the ride. One of the things that when researching that found interesting was that people would steal the apple from the Evil Queen, and I'm like, one, why? Why would you want to steal that? Is my first question, and two, why? Why? How have you managed to get that apple out of the ride? Because when you get out the cart, wouldn't you shoot maybe through bags? I just find it quite interesting that we don't have that. It's really how did you get that past Hearst? It's bizarre, but I do find it quite interestingly. So that was Snow White's first attraction, and then when Snow White's Scary Adventure was brought over to Magic Kingdom in Walt Disney World, and it's also in Disneyland Paris. It's across all of the parks really till 2014 when we saw the revamp of Fantasyland at Disneyland, Walt Disney World actually. Beg pardon me. And Snow White's Scary Adventure was replaced with what is now Fairy Tale Princess Hall because the Seven Dwarfs Mine Train replaced it as the Snow White attraction in Fantasyland. And a lot of the many of the animatronics that are featured, especially at the end of the ride where they're dancing in the cottage and the Evil Queen is outside, they are the original animatronics from that ride. So it's really good to see that they're still recycling and they still are there to this day, just in a new ride. And I've never done Seven Dwarfs Mine Train, just because when I went in 2014, it was still getting built. So a lot of new Fantasyland, I don't really know. I never got to do because it was still getting built. So it's a really interesting thing to think about and see that Snow White still has so much of a legacy within the Disney parks. You can meet Snow White at the Fairy Tale Princess Hall. I know that you could meet her at the Germany Pavilion in Epcot. I don't know if that's still the case now. I haven't actually looked at that, but I do know that was something that you could do. And I do love that she's still part of the parks and that she's very much integral to a lot of the Disney-ness that we know today and very much in line with what we know and how we discuss this today. And I do think it's a really unique perspective to think about and talk about in terms of structure and storytelling, that this was the original blueprint for everything that's come before. We wouldn't have Disney today, I don't think, without Snow White, without this massive risk. And as we all know, Disney would constantly have to take massive risks throughout the story of Disney's life. We all know the ups and downs, as we will discuss and delve into over the course of this podcast. And it's really interesting that seems to be a Disney princess film kind of saves Disney's life a lot of the time. And I find that quite interesting to think about. And honestly, I do think we need to really deep down into that. But I really think this film was the blueprint. It's a beautifully crafted film that I think audiences don't tend to rewatch anymore. And I do think that it would be nice for you to go away and watch this and have a much more of a deep dive into the history and how interesting the crafting of this film was and what it did today. And that's what I really think is fascinating to think about in terms of storytelling and allowing for this real delve into a unique and fascinating story. And that's where I'm really going to end the discussion on Snow White today. I'd like to just thank you for listening. And I'd also like to thank you for your continuous support with the podcast, as I know it's only new and I know that I've seen a lot of love the last few days, especially from some of my Disney friends who have really championed this podcast and really championed me doing this, because I've always wanted to do a podcast. I've always thought about it, and I do think that it is an interesting thing to do. So what I'm going to do each week is I'm going to shout out some people. And this week I just want to shout out my friends Chris Fella, and who's known as the Gay Wanderlust on Instagram, and Tom Taylor, who's known as Tom02 Disney on Instagram. I might have got them wrong, but please go and give them a follow because they are very lovely people and very nice to me and really welcomes me into this Disney community. And I also want to just say thank you to everyone who has listened and everyone who hopefully will listen and take a much more deeper and interest into this, because this is a really deep podcast thing of mine. I really, really love Disney. And I really want to learn more about it, to be fair, because I'm only young. And I really want to have a much more insightful and deepful media deep dive into it. And I also just want to say thank you, just another big thank you to everyone who's already listened first to meet the host, the first episode, and really interacted with me on Instagram. Please keep interacting because I do love chatting. And if you have any thoughts, please don't be afraid to drop them in the comments. Give me a DM on Instagram. Tell me your thoughts, and maybe I can. Maybe you might hear me talk about your thoughts on the podcast. Maybe we'll have a segment for it. You never know. So I just want to say thank you for listening, and just a reminder that you can follow me on Instagram at Straight Until Disney Pod. And thank you for listening. Bye.